If you live in the US, chances are you've heard of Target, and maybe you've even been to Target.com. Now, Target is based here in Minnesota, where I am, and so I thought it would be fun to take a look at Target.com and see what kind of web performance does it have. What makes it even more interesting is that over the years, I was a consultant in the Twin Cities software industry, and so I've worked with a whole bunch of different software developers that have either worked or continued to work at Target on the website. So I wanted to take a look at how good of a job are they doing, how fast is Target.com. As I load the homepage, it sure pops in very quickly. I do notice a couple of things. We've got this sponsored section that sort of collapses here, which I think is a little strange. But otherwise, actually, we're seeing great performance. And I guess that's not hugely surprising. Probably the homepage is one of the things that's most visible and most likely to be optimized. We've got a few other major categories here. Now, if you're familiar with Target, you know it sells just the essentials. Things like decorative objects, spring candles, and decorative storage. Now, this latter category is one of my wife's favorite categories to shop in. So why don't we take a look at it and see what kind of options are in here. Now, this page was a little bit slower, and did you see that? That was a layout shift. So all this data is being piped to request metrics. So let's see if, we'll look at that data in a second and see if we can quantify how big that layout shift was. Otherwise, things are pretty fast here, but that is a pretty nasty delay and layout shift. So here we are in request metrics, and we're looking at all of the page performance data that I collected while I was browsing Target.com. And as a quick aside, if you were to install request metrics on your own site, you would actually be getting all of the data from all of the users. But because I can't install the agent on their site, all we have is the data from my session. So if we take a look overall, I would say my first reaction is that the performance of Target.com is excellent. We can see that the 75th percentile load is almost under a second, which is really phenomenal. All of the web vitals, of which there are 6, look pretty good, except the cumulative layout shift. And as we keep looking around, I mean, the page load is really outstanding. And even though you see this large client bar, so that means that the bulk of the time on any given page load was actually spent in sort of client scripting time. However, it's a little bit misleading because actually we're only out at 1 second here. So this is still very impressive. The server is really impressive. This thing is coming back before 100 milliseconds. So overall, performance does look pretty good, but we did notice there was that CLS issue. So let's dive into that and see if we can figure out what's going on. So the easiest way to start is just to click Investigate CLS under the problem area here. And now we're taken to a nice page where everything is all about the CLS of the site. And so you've got a couple of different graphs here. The first is going to be your overall summary. And so this actually tells us one thing right off the bat. Even though there are some pages with some very bad CLS values, there's actually a whole host of pages that are just fine. And we've also got an over time graph here. And so, I'm just looking at the last 24 hours. We could even make it the last 60 minutes to see the data with a little higher fidelity. But the real meat of this screen actually here is in this list. And so this list is by URL, the different URLs that I've loaded. And you can group the URLs, or you can look at the raw original URL, depending on how your site works. But for each different URL, we list the number of CLS values we've seen for that URL, the URL, when we've last seen that URL, and then the P50, 75, and 95 for that URL. And so here it is very obvious where the problem lies. Maybe something a little bit going on here, but for the most part, it is our neutral decorative storage pages where we saw that significant layout shift that are in fact causing the problem. And so we can actually drill in here. And now we're just looking at this URL. And so we can see that the CLS is quite bad. There are a few times actually where it wasn't so bad. But the most important thing about this screen is we get actual attribution, real actionable data that will show you exactly which elements on your page we're moving. So here we can see we've got 3 specific elements that we're moving, and this one up top here is actually the one that's moving the most often. And we'll come back to this in just a second. One other thing that this page will show you is actually what part of the page load lifecycle does the layout shift usually occur. And in this case, every single one of them is after load is complete. But sometimes this gives you an interesting signal of where to start looking in terms of the timeline and what's happening with the rest of the page. And finally, we've got a list of all of the page loads for this URL. And we've got their load time, their worst vital, which in this case is pretty much always CLS. And we can pop these open and we can get a little bit more information. Like if these are from different users, we could quickly look at the country or the operating system or that kind of thing. And we can actually go into one of these and we can even look and see what is going on here specifically. So here we can see that it's 812 milliseconds for page load. That's pretty good. But over on the right-hand side here, we've got our core web vitals. And so we can see that for this page load, mostly it was good, but here's our poor CLS. And so we can even get this CLS analysis going. So in this particular case, it was that page body container element. And you can see here's where this one falls on the histogram of all the CLSs. And we can see that this particular element shifted most on 82% of the page loads. And then it was responsible for this amount of the shift. So more than one element can shift during a layout shift. This particular element was responsible for causing 0.416 as a value in the layout shift, but the overall shift is 0.49. So there were some other elements moving too. They just weren't the biggest mover. The other thing that we track is when did this occur? And so we can see that almost always this particular page has a layout shift occur after load, right? Because load time was about 1 second. This is usually about 0.3 seconds after. Now let's go back out and look at another page load and see if we see similar behavior. So let's go to maybe this one. All right, and let's go open the CLS analysis pop-up again. And we see again, it's this page body container element. So I want to talk about this a little bit. We can actually copy this selector and run it on this page in question and see which elements were actually moving. So we can just use this external link here to get to the neutral decorative storage page. I'm going to fire up the dev tools, and there's a handy little shortcut if you've never used it. The $2 signs works in Chrome, and it's kind of a document query selector all. So I'm going to hit this, and this actually matches 5 divs. And you might be a little surprised that it's 5 elements that come up with the selector instead of just 1. Well, the Request Metrics agent uses Google's Web Vitals JS under the covers, which is sort of the reference implementation of measuring Web Vitals. And unfortunately, if there's not a class or ID or something to more distinctly identify an element, you do end up sometimes with situations where there's more than one. But in this case, it's not really a problem, because if we look at the 5, we've got this, we've got a 0 height div, we've got the ad itself, and then we've got this guy right here, which is the div that contains all of the list items and the filtering and sorting. And so in order to get a cumulative layout shift over 0.4, it was going to be a very big element that shifted. So my guess is it was actually this one caused by loading this ad. And we'll see that again if we load it, and then poop, it pops in and this whole section moves down. So we could very easily fix the CLS issues on this page simply by reserving enough height for this advertisement.